Let me know when I'm good. All right, so this is NeXpose for, gotta move this down a little bit, for automated compromise detection by Santana. That's me. So who am I? I'm an independent security researcher, and I look, like I was saying earlier, like that 12-year-old at conferences. On Twitter, I go by @connection with a 0 instead of an O, and I'm possibly Red Foo, as we saw a little bit earlier. Actually, like I think if I roll into like HackerCons looking like that, it'd be pretty dope. I think I'm gonna start dressing that way. Yeah. So here's a quick overview of the talk. We're gonna talk about like some common IOCs, like indicators of compromise. We're gonna talk about NeXpose authenticated scans. We're gonna talk about NeXpose jess and what that is, and like what this means. And then there's like a plot twist, because everyone likes plot twists. So when we talk about like indicators of compromise or IOCs, like a lot of them that we think of are like network anomaly based. Like if this user is SSHing to a different box that he like normally doesn't SSH to, like that's an anomaly, like possible compromise. Like you should look into it, and it makes sense. But like NeXpose really can't monitor that. Like that's what you need an actual like network anomaly detection solution for. But what NeXpose can do is let us look at certain files that get touched when people hop onto boxes, like varlog, wtemp, which shows like the last people that are logged in, the bash history. Well, like the cool thing about actually the wtemp is that you can't really clear it out without being root. So like if they compromise you but aren't able to root your box, like bam, left a little artifact real quick. The bash history, that can be wiped and like disabled and all that, but if the attacker isn't sophisticated enough to like do that, then plethora of information there. SSH authorized keys and known hosts are kind of interesting. If like you're checking them regularly and you know which key should be in there, and you see like a new key, like that's really weird. Like that means someone's been possibly compromised and someone dropped a key so they could SSH into it later. And known host is really indicative of that too. Like typically people will hit the same couple boxes, and like so their known host file will be fairly small, like a couple hosts that they talk to. But seeing new hosts show up in there is like really weird. That means someone's SSHing where they shouldn't be SSHing. It just looks really fishy from an observer's standpoint. So what are NeXpose authenticated scans? Basically what it sounds like. You can give NeXpose a set of credentials, and it'll log in with them. Like you can give SSH creds, and whenever it sees SSH on a server, logs in with those creds and does things. It's super useful for doing things like checking if patches are installed on like Windows boxes, or in the case of like all this crazy stuff with that bash bug, like logging into a bunch of like Linux workstations and making sure that they're all patched up. It also lets you query files that are on the disk, which is pretty cool. You can do things like, hey NeXpose, I'm going to write a check, and you're going to log into the box with these creds and tell me if a file exists, or tell me the file permissions on it. So like that's pretty cool. You could also, using NeXpose, probe files for information, which is pretty cool. Like you're like, hey, get some information out of this file. There's a little bit of shortcomings with that, and we'll see that in a bit. But you could also interface with the Windows registry, which is great. Like if you're doing like analysis on a Windows box, you can check like common places in the registry where malware gets added to auto startup, and you're like, bam, good to go. Like, got this. Like, I know where the attacker came in from now. So NeXpose jess. Jess is a rules engine that's based on Java, and it's a pretty simple. I guess I wouldn't say simple, but the concept of a rule-based language is pretty simple, and it like plays well with NeXpose. The basic idea is that it's if-then styled logic. So you're like, if it's a Windows computer and there's this key in the registry, then do this. Super simple, like basically like writing a bunch of if statements. It gets more complex because the NeXpose exposed API is pretty large and sadly undocumented. So it's a little daunting to get into like coding Jess. And it's Java based, so basically everyone but me can code in it. Sadly true, I suck at Java. All right, so like here's an example of Jess. In the back it might be a little difficult to see, and I'm sorry. But so like here's some Jess code that checks the permissions of a file and sees if they're like 600. This one's like on Etsy Shadow, I believe. I pulled it out of like an already created one. But we see that it's like, hey, try this. Check out this file. Like that happened earlier in the code, but it's like, check that the file has mode 600, or that the current user that we're logged in as can read and write to this file. makes sense. Like check it real quick. Etsy shadow, like if it doesn't have 600 permission, then it kicks off an error. So that's like a small example of it. But what does this what does it mean? Well, it means that like leveraging normal XML styled vulnerability checks with NeXpose, you can write custom checks to look for certain things. You can use Jess to help that if like you're better off in Java. And yeah, so like it's pretty cool because you can pull data from like varlog, wtemp, and like the bash history, SSH, known hosts and stuff. So that's pretty cool. And additionally, once you code them, you add it to your policy, and then you're good to go. Like that check, it will always run every time you run your like scheduled scans. So like in theory, this is really awesome. You end up with a pretty cool like use of NeXpose, which it definitely wasn't made for. We all know like NeXpose as a vulnerability scanner and like definitely good in vulnerability management, but kind of tried to like backwards engineer it and make it do something else. So that was the basic idea behind like the initial research for this. But like it's not perfect. Sadly, it's not perfect. There's, like I was saying earlier, there's a limited amount of data that can be returned like within a couple kilobytes. So if it's a large bash history, like you're screwed. It's gonna get truncated. You lose a bunch of data. Like it really becomes useless. And writing checks is actually pretty hard. Like very simple checks, very simple to write. Like check if /wp-post.php is on this website. Like that's easy enough to write in basically any language. But like more complicated things and like interacting with the file system is like not super easy with NeXpose. So like that's another hurdle that we quickly run into. It requires manual analysis, which sucks. Like there's really like, unless you export to like XML or something and then like have something parsed through the XML and like do the anomaly detection for you, it's a manual process. You're like, all right, well like here's a wtemp and like everything looks normal, or like here's the SSH known host, everything looks normal. So like that part also like no good. A lot of overhead that way. And you run into an issue where like logs are easily mangled. Like if someone roots your box, like you can't really trust those logs at this point. Like they could have been completely removed. They could have been like, they could just redact their own presence on the box. They could make it look like someone else logged in the box. But like actually what I learned was that it sucks. It sucks trying to do this with NeXpose. Like, and I thought it would be a great idea, right? Like I was like, this is cool, add it to your scans and you're good to go. But I realized you end up dedicating a lot more time to writing checks and like making sure they work, and like it doesn't really pay off in the end. Especially because like I was saying about the Jess thing, like it's undocumented, and that's strictly because like Rapid7 really doesn't encourage anyone outside of like Rapid7's own like coders to make these checks. So because of that, you're kind of like going off like blind. Like the way that I learned how to like code Jess was to literally just like open up a file that someone had written and just like look through the code and like bastardize my way through it. So like if you have any issues with your like custom plugins and stuff, like you're kind of SOL, like you're on your own at that point. And so like you quickly start seeing that like things just aren't adding up. Like it's not super useful to use NeXpose for this. What a twist. But here's what I really learned. Like NeXpose is great, but not for this. Like I learned how to write NeXpose checks, and like I could write a lot of cool stuff now. But the more and more I tried to implement those into like IOC like analyzers, the more I realized it's hard. Like trying to learn like from an undocumented language and like frankencoding your way through things is terrible. Even the XML checks like for interfacing with the file system are hard. Like there's a bunch of other things that you could do where it's like, hey, like just FTP to this server, and like it's easy enough to write. But when it starts coming down to dealing with actual file system stuff, like screwed. And yeah, like the custom checks aren't supported. So if you can't get your check to work, like deal with it, like figure it out or move on. So yeah, it's definitely much better for vuln scanning than incident response, mainly because vuln checks are fairly binary. Like, hey, if they're running Apache and it's this version, then they're vulnerable. Like, it's a fairly straightforward process. Whereas, like, looking at, like, log files and stuff, it's not, like, instantly obvious whether or not you were compromised, because, like, NeXpose is definitely not that smart to do it, so you have to go through it yourself. So, yeah, like, IOCs are, like, really difficult to start nailing down with NeXpose. And then I was like, I gotta make this work though. Like, it's such a great idea, such a novel idea. Like, I need to make this work. I just kept running into a lot of issues. So here's an example of a jess script. This is the Unix enum Java, and basically it just fingerprints what version of Java you're running. And it's pretty cray. Like, it doesn't really look like a programming language that I'm really familiar with. There's like brackets or like parentheses everywhere and like question marks, and it just looks weird. So like having to learn this was hard, especially because again, it was undocumented. So this is one of the first hurdles that I ran into, was just like, how do I learn from this? And just like plowing through all the CLP files, which is the jess stuff that's outputted. Like, having to learn that way was very difficult. And writing XML checks, like I said, like this one's an HTTP one, it's a little easier. But writing XML checks are also really weird because you have to make two different files. You have to write the VCK file, which is the vulnerability check file, as well as an XML file, which like it leverages to like give information back to the user. So like this one's fairly straightforward. Like, it's XML, like most people know it. And as you can see, like it's pretty intuitive. Like once you get the hang of it, it's like, hey, we're gonna only do this for HTTP and HTTPS. Like that's what our network service is set as. And then within the product, like child, it's the disk station 4.3, and then it's like, hey, here's the range of like IP that it could be on, or the IP range that it could be on. So it's like, cool, like 3809, like it knows where to scan, it knows what it's doing, and yeah, so like it's fairly easy to like write those simple ones. This one's for a Synology, a CVE that was published last year. But then you also have to write, like this is just a snippet from the entire file, like, but then you also have to write all this, and like I just couldn't find anything to like automate this process. Like I'm just like typing all this XML by hand. This one I stole from the same guy who wrote the well, I didn't steal, but like I'm borrowing from the guy who wrote the previous check. But if you notice, like there's a lot more information on there. It's like a lot of typing and just kind of sucks. Like, and if you mess something up, like debugging it is terrible. You're just like, where did I mess up all my XMLs? So like I came to this moment at one point. I was like, man, I thought this would be like a really great idea. Like, sounds awesome. I wanted to do it, but then I'm like, man, it sounds awesome. But as I'm like learning more and more about like trying to implement this, like it is terrible. Like, this sucks. So I was like, man, I'm kind of at this point where like I want to talk about something cool, but man, it's just like not really working out to my favor. So like I wanted to have some takeaways, right? Like I wanted to turn this like basically failed research venture into like something that's still useful. So like I learned that it's hard to make Swiss Army knives, and I tried to do that. I tried to take NeXpose and make it like a vuln scanner and like an IOC detector and like just all this stuff, and like, man, it's hard to write something like that, and like even just like, especially if you're just modifying something that like is already out there, like it became difficult. Even like trying to use their own like methods for like writing checks, it was really hard actually. And it wasn't even that effective. Like, I got a couple checks working, but like it was basically useless because you can only gather some data. Like, if something's over a couple kilobytes, like you lose that data. Like, which makes sense. Like, they don't want to like overload the NeXpose sensors and stuff like that and scanners. But it's hard, and I couldn't find a way to like only scan a certain range from like a file, so I could be like, hey, just basically like re-implement tail for NeXpose and like just give me like the last whatever, like 200 lines or whatever. I couldn't find a way to do that. Like, it was really difficult. So like that was another big hurdle. Like, as soon as your logs start growing, like you're screwed. You only get the first portion of it, and it's totally not a network anomaly detection like solution. Like, I thought I could like force it to, like, just brute force it into doing this, and I couldn't. And then I learned that sometimes research is really cool but doesn't pan out, and like kind of learned to like abort projects a little earlier actually. Like, I bashed my head on in this like for so long because I was like, this is so cool, like I want to talk about this. That being said, there's also a couple scripts that were written, some checks and stuff, and I'll be pushing those out to like GitHub later on in the day when I'm more stable on my internets. But yeah, like there's a couple checks that like do some of this stuff, but again, it's not super useful. Like, you get some data, and it's like, whatever. It's like, I realized I was trying to beat a dead horse at one point. It's just way too much, like, overhead. So, like, this is, like, my issues and my struggles trying to do this. I was like, alright, I have to create NeXpose checks. Well, what does that mean? Well, like, I gotta learn Jess. I gotta learn their XML formatting, and then, like, I also have to debug these for hours to make sure that things actually work. It's just like, man, I could have just I could have, like, scripted SSHing into a box and checking for this thing at this point. Like, it's getting really crazy. And then, like, even after I do that, I have to manually, like, go through everything and analyze it, and the checks are dumb. Like, they don't know that things are vulnerable because they're not actual vulnerability checks. They're just like, hey, here's a file. And, so it sucked too, because if you include this on, like, your normal, like, perimeter sweeps or, like, authenticated scans as per usual, like, you run into this issue where, like, you end up with now a huge report, because, like, every box it SSHs into, like, whatever vulns it finds, it also, like, dumps out all this information from, like, bash history, and, like, your exported reports end up being a lot bigger, which kind of sucks to go through. And you're, like, it's honestly better off avoiding this entirely, which sucks, right? Like, I hate to say that about, like, a project I thought would be super cool, but I definitely was like, man, it's, like, I wish I could do something with this, because NeXpose is a great tool. Like, I've used it. Like, when I was a consultant, I used it a lot as my de facto scanner, and I wanted to make it more, and realized, like, that doesn't always work. Oh, yeah.
You realize you can, with NeXpose, you can actually write your own custom checks.
Yeah, well, that's what I was saying with, like, some of the Jess stuff. Like, it's like, so Jess is a very difficult language to learn. Like,
Yeah, it's not intuitive. I'll believe that.
yeah, like, it's hard to see in the back, but yeah, like, it's really crazy, like, snippets. I'm sure once you learn it, like, it's a lot easier, right? But, like, it's undocumented, which made it really hard, like, to learn anything. You have to learn by example. But yeah, so that was the basic idea. And, like, I did get some checks written, and, like, they do some of this stuff, but it's like, I don't know, like, I thought it was always just, like, better off to avoid it, because it was so much hassle to, like, get things going, and, like, not enough return. But it is important to routinely check for IOCs, and, like, find a way to, like, make it part of your security program. And so, like, NeXpose is probably not the best solution. That being said, if you do dedicate your time to writing those custom checks, like, you could use it. You, like, theoretically could leverage this to do it. The downside to that is that, like, it's a lot of a time investment, and I just didn't see it, like, being worthwhile, honestly.
So do you have a better solution for writing vulnerability and
Excuse me?
That's really kind of a harsh statement.
I'm sorry, like, I didn't hear the first part.
Do you have a better solution for writing your vulnerabilities as a scanner to do its version check?
No, like the way that NeXpose does it, and the way that a lot of, like, vulnerability scanners do it is, like, perfect, and, like, it works. Like, it works for vulnerability scanning. I was basically trying to, like, backwards engineer NeXpose to do something it wasn't developed to do, simply because I was like, cool, like, it has authenticated scans, and I could, like, interface with the file system. Like, this should be easy, and realized pretty quickly, like, well, this is why, like, NeXpose doesn't have this feature, because it's a pain in the ass to, like, actually implement. Like, it's terrible. Like, I would hate to have to maintain all these checks. And I even looked at doing it with Nessus, which like, lets you run shell commands and stuff if you're authenticated scanning, and even that is, like, still kind of a hassle to do a lot of this.
I will say it is fully documented.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it was a little weird, like, only because, like, Rapid7 was like, hey, we don't advise anyone that's not a Rapid7, like, check writer to, like, use Jess at all, like, so they didn't document it. Like, it's totally internally documented, I'm sure. But, yeah, so it was, yeah, that'd be great. Like, it would be really awesome, actually. Like, I might actually, like, be able to make decent checks for, like, NeXpose if I could, like, look at actual documentation. So if you've got the power to do that, that'd be awesome, man. Yeah. Excuse me? I did, and I did, and, like, on the community site, and, like, what's it called? Like, Security Street or something like that. Yeah, like, some people have posted up examples of theirs, but, it's just that, right? Like, it's just their code snippet, and they're, like, asking for help or something, or, like, showing off what they wrote, and there's not really a way to learn, like, actually, like, on the community. Yeah, exactly. And another thing too that was pretty weird was when you go on the community site, they're like, hey, we really don't have any documentation, but like just go learn Jess and you'll be fine. Like they link you to the art and zen of Jess is like the article they linked to or something. And I was like, that's cool. Like I'll learn this programming language, but like I don't know how to interface with NeXpose using this right now. Like I don't know where people got all these weird like methods that they're calling. So yeah, like it becomes very difficult to try to do this work when you're like brute forcing your way through and just like frank-encoding things. And then like I learned that refactoring tools is messy for like very many of the same reasons I was just talking about. Like sure, like you can make custom checks, but like you're still forcing NeXpose. Like you're basically like making NeXpose bend over backwards, and like it's not designed to do this. I'm sure given enough time, like you could definitely like write some good checks for it, but it did not work out that way, like in my favor. So yeah, like oh yes. I don't have a solution honestly. Like I like no, yeah, exactly. And so like that's why I was like, let's leverage NeXpose only because like it already does a lot of the good stuff. It like SSH is into like servers or like it can go into Windows boxes, like do all that. And I was like, it'll be easy. Like I can just write a bunch of these checks, and it's like it's a lot harder than it sounds, right? But I don't have an alternative, right? Like I guess I can go to Nessus, but like it doesn't matter. Like I'd run into the same issue where I'm basically like trying to force a vulnerability scanner to be like an anomaly detection tool, and it's just like it was a little ambitious, I guess. But I actually do. I would like to see it just because it'd be so sweet if I could just like scan my own network and it goes through and it's like here's all your vulns as well as like this is like a really weird SSH key right here. Like that'd be pretty cool. Just like proactiveness and like including it into like monthly or weekly scans or something.
Well, I would argue it already does that, so why wouldn't you do that? Yeah, I don't understand that. It already does that. That's the whole purpose of the compliance of your economic script, to detect how.
Like I suppose like, and I could see that. Like I was thinking more so like just like artifacts left over on the box that like it's gonna look fairly innocuous to a scanner, right? Like oh, there's some SSH keys in an SSH key file, like they're supposed to be there. And so like my idea was go through those and like sadly you have to manually go through and like that SSH key doesn't look right. And so like agreed. Like I agree completely. And that's why like it's not an end-all be-all solution. Like I started realizing, especially like everyone's network is going to be different, right? Like so like you start running into this issue where you have a lot of like internal teams like having to write their own custom checks. And so when I realized that was kind of what was going on, I also realized like, man, this lack of documentation is like kind of scary. Just because like I can hardly teach myself, and I'm supposed to like tell people like, yeah, just go like go learn NeXpose Jess, like it'll be fine. And so yeah, like that was another issue I started running into. Like no two networks are the same. So like I can make blanket things that like grab certain files that like are fairly ubiquitous, but like only you know your network and only you know like the boxes on there and stuff. And that's why you need that manual overhead, right? Like unless you write a parser later on and you're like, hey, only these things are accepted on these hosts, and like if you see anything outside of that, then like pop up an alert. But then at that point, like you basically just made a network anomaly detection solution. So like you're better off probably buying one and saving a lot of time, like writing all those checks.
But that's the specific scenario, right? So do you expect my content users to really catch every scenario?
Oh no.
That'll never happen the same way.
No, yeah, of course. Like, this is definitely like, when I was devising this, I was like, hey, I want something where I just add it to my normal scans, right? Like, I'm gonna run these scans anyway, and they're gonna be authenticated scans. So, like, why not throw in a couple things that like just looks like? Definitely, it's a proactive thing, or it's a reactive thing, and not a proactive thing. Like, I'm not like constantly just scanning my boxes. But I feel like it's useful, even if you have to do like the manual thing. Like it sucks trudging through that manually, but like I feel like there is a lot of use in being able to get some of that kind of data back, and like I just didn't see that currently in the tools, at least like.
So what if we give you like a UI that actually walks you through the list instead of actually making the breakdown code to type read?
Yeah, like that would be phenomenal actually if there's like a or even just an IDE to like hint me forward somewhere, right? Like help me out somewhere. Yeah. Yeah, no, dude, that would be great. Like, and like that would actually make things a lot easier, I think. And it's cool too because it exposes. I mean, I guess like because Rapid7 like in that blog post was saying that like they kind of like want to keep only Rapid7 people like making these scripts, like make sure they work and everything. Like, and so I get why it's kind of difficult for someone to just like jump in, but yeah, if it was more like readily available to the people, like I feel like this like would have gone so much easier, and like I probably would have had like a boatload of checks that I could have made. That makes sense. That actually that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, so yeah, stuff like tools, I feel like that'd be the thing. Even if it's not like an officially licensed like Rapid7 thing, right? Even if someone from the community like just knows enough Jest where they're like, I'm gonna make a GUI, like that would make lives really easy. Because like writing checks like in XML, like I call them like the old days, like dude, it sucks. Like, and if I could leverage Jest and like actually program checks, like that'd be amazing. Because I could like churn those out left and right. So yeah, I think that's actually final slide, and I think I'm running on time. Yeah, so I'm cutting it close. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes. Yeah, so that, oh, go ahead. Oh yeah, so I'll just repeat it for like the video. The basic idea was the question was, hey, so like your proof of concept was you want to leverage like NeXpose, which is traditionally like a vulnerability scanner, to like look for flags and artifacts that you've been compromised. And yeah, like that was the initial idea. And yeah, like I found out if I had a lot more time to actually like deep dive and learn Jest and like learn how like go through a lot of the CPL files and like see how other people were doing things, like I could have probably eventually figured it out, but like the time investment was just like not in it for me. I'm like having to learn an entire language to like write one quick check, and like I'm basically only learning enough of the language to write that check, and like having to constantly learn like relearn the language for different aspects like was crazy. Like, and I was like, this is way too ambitious. Like definitely like I wouldn't recommend trying to write those Jest scripts unless you have like a decent amount of experience doing it or like have a lot of time to learn it. Yeah. Any other questions, or am I good on time, or cool? Any other questions, comments, concerns, obscenities to yell at me? All right, cool. That's it.